I'd like to welcome you to the Eversheds Sutherland Webcast, Advisors Act Regulatory Second Quarter Update. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Michael Koffler and Issa Hanna. And this program is the second in our quarterly series of complimentary webcasts dedicated to issues impacting investment advisors. One housekeeping item before we start. If you'd like to receive CLE credit for this webcast, please download the CLE sign-in sheet and evaluation form from your viewing console and follow the instructions for submission. And also, in terms of questions, please feel free to ask questions. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the Ask a Question text box on your viewing console. And also, before we get started, if you'd like to request a copy of the slide deck, please contact any one of us, Michael, Issa, or me, and we'd be happy to get you a copy of the deck. So with that said, we're dealing with a period where we continue to see intense regulatory scrutiny on investment advisor, and what we're trying to do with this webcast series is look at recent regulatory developments, enforcement, exam developments that deal with investment advisors, and give you something to think about as you think about your legal and compliance programs. What we're looking to do and deal with today, we have an ambitious agenda. There's a lot to cover. We want to first start off with digital advisors, then conflicted compensation arrangements. We want to spend time on the custody rule guidance. We want to discuss trading away in wrap accounts, and then quicker updates on the exam priorities, 5 most frequent deficiencies, and other developments also. We're ready to get started, and in terms of digital advisors, we want to start off by spending a few minutes on digital advisors, and we also want to target our discussion on the SEC guidance update that came about in February 2017. There's a couple of reasons why we want to pay attention to this. Number one, obviously with respect to if you're dealing with a digital advisor or algorithms or something, this guidance from the SEC helps to give shape to the regulatory framework. It's an important piece of the emerging regulatory framework, and it's something that had been anticipated, and there's been a lot of there's been certain negative statements about digital advice and robo advice from Massachusetts, for instance, and this is this helps sort of shape that, it helps temper that, and it gives the SEC's position. So again, it's very important, obviously, if you're dealing with digital or robo advisors. I'm going to turn it over to Issa now, but the other reason you want to pay attention to this, even if you don't deal directly with digital advisors or robo-advisors, there's important concepts just in terms of day-to-day advisor practice that the staff is highlighting, and the staff expects that will be taken into account with respect to compliance programs. So with that, let me hand it over to Issa to walk through the slides.
Thank you, Cliff, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. In terms of this guidance update that the SEC issued earlier this year, February 2017. From the outset of it, the SEC staff explains its twofold purpose for issuing it, and the first was to provide robo-advisors with some information or considerations that they should take into account as they seek to meet their legal obligations under the Advisors Act. And you should note that the way that the SEC staff phrased that is significantly different from how the Massachusetts robo-advisor release kind of phrased it. What Massachusetts was concerned about was just an overall, perhaps an inability of an investment advisor to meet its fiduciary obligations under their version or their state securities laws applicable to investment advisors. The SEC staff doesn't take that approach. Instead, they are issuing this guidance update in general to help robo-advisors meet their fiduciary obligations. There's an assumption that they can meet their fiduciary obligations. And the second purpose of the guidance update is also to offer suggestions for how robo-advisors can address some of the issues that are identified in the guidance update. So what really colors the overall guidance is the unique considerations, in the SEC staff's words, that arise in connection with robo-advice, things that are unique or novel to the robo-advisor business model. And the SEC really keys in on three unique considerations or novelties to the robo-advisor business model. The first being reliance on algorithms. The second being delivery of advisory services over the Internet. And then the third being the limited, if any, direct human interaction between the advisor and the end client. So the SEC staff uses those issues as kind of a launching point to get into three general compliance areas that it wanted to discuss. First, the substance and presentation of client disclosures about the robo-advisor and the investment advisory services it offers. Second, how a robo-advisor can obtain information from clients to support its duty to provide suitable investment advice. And then third, how a robo-advisor can adopt and implement an effective compliance program that's reasonably designed to address the particular concerns relevant to providing investment advice. Really how a robo-advisor can meet its 20647 obligations with respect to a compliance program. So moving on to the next slide, regarding this first topic that the SEC staff decided to focus on, the substance of presentation disclosures. Really, the SEC's tactic in this guidance update is first to kind of identify the challenges that are specific to the robo-advisor business model in the particular area. And then after it identifies the challenges, the SEC staff says, okay, so this is how one might go about addressing the particular challenges that we've identified. So with respect to disclosures, the SEC staff identified as a challenge the limited or non-existent interaction with advisory personnel means that the client might not have enough information to make an informed decision regarding entering into the advisory relationship. Basically, if you don't have that human interaction, you might not have a member of the advisory personnel to really hammer home a disclosure concept or to really highlight a particular issue relating to the investment advisor. Another risk that the SEC staff identified was that clients just might not understand the robo-advisor's business model. It's a new model. They might not understand the scope of the services, or that the disclosure might be so extensive and presented in an electronic format that it might become buried or incomprehensible to the client. So what did the staff suggest? The staff suggested that robo-advisors provide disclosure about their business model. They should provide a description of the assumptions and limitations of the algorithms that they use to manage client accounts. For example, if the algorithm is based on modern portfolio theory, say that, and describe all the assumptions behind the theory and the limitations of it. Another suggestion that the SEC staff offered was to provide a fulsome disclosure of the scope of services being provided. If the robo-advisor isn't providing a comprehensive financial plan, you should say that, and you should say what's included in the robo-advice and what isn't. If the robo-advice is only being provided to meet a particular financial goal, such as saving for college or saving up for a down payment for a house, you should make that clear in the disclosures. And the third point that the SEC made related to the presentation of disclosures, and they provided a number of examples about how an investment advisor or robo-advisor can present the disclosures to really make them more clear and understandable to clients. But one idea that the SEC staff put forward was emphasizing key disclosures through design features like pop-up boxes. So moving on to the next slide, and the next topic that the SEC staff discussed in the guidance update, they really honed in on the unique considerations that come into play when a robo-advisor is trying to collect enough information from a prospective client or a client to kind of form the suitable investment advice that an advisor is required to provide pursuant to its fiduciary duty. So some challenges that the SEC identified in the robo-advisor context. Perhaps a questionnaire that the robo-advisor is using is just too rigid. It's not giving the client enough of a chance to provide information or context for their responses. Maybe the client has a particular financial situation that's just not being picked up by the questionnaire that's kind of tailored, no, not narrowly tailored, but maybe a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. The second challenge that the SEC identified is that, if there's no human interaction between the client and the robo-advisor, you might not have advisory personnel there to ask follow-up questions or clarifying questions about client responses to the questionnaire. Maybe the client is giving inconsistent responses. You don't have that person to deal with the inconsistent responses and point that out to the client, or to just answer any client questions that come up in the context of filling out that questionnaire. And the third challenge that the SEC staff identified is that clients might have the option of selecting some kind of portfolio or strategy that is different from what's recommended by the robo-advisor, but they're not adequately informed of the risks of doing that and the fact that that might not be suitable for the identified investment objectives and goals of the client of the robo-advisor. So what does the SEC staff recommend as some ideas to help collect the right information and for purposes of supporting the robo-advisor suitability obligation? One thing that a robo-advisor can do is implement a system to automatically flag inconsistent information and point that out to the client and ask the client to resolve the inconsistency. Or just have somebody at the robo-advisor, somebody at the personnel, follow up with the client individually and resolve the discrepancy. Second suggestion that the SEC staff made is if a client is selecting some portfolio that's different from what's recommended, perhaps provide some color or some kind of warning through a pop-up box explaining to the client why the recommended strategy or portfolio better meets the client's needs and why they should reconsider going with something different. So the final point that the SEC staff covered in the guidance update was implementing an effective compliance program for a robo-advisor and the considerations that a robo-advisor should take into account when they are crafting a compliance program that is tailored to the robo-advisor business model. So the challenge that the SEC staff identified, basically that the robo-advisor business model is much different from the typical investment advisor, and as a result, you should be crafting policies and procedures that are specific to the inherent business model and risks that a robo-advisor or that are attendant to the robo-advisor business model. So, what does the SEC staff suggest? So, obviously, the algorithm that a robo-advisor uses as part of its advice is critical, and something that a robo-advisor should do, according to the SEC, is have policies and procedures that call for testing and back testing of algorithmic code and post-implementation monitoring of its performance. And the policies and procedures should ensure that that the code is performing as it's represented, and that whenever there are any modifications to the algorithmic code, there's no adverse effect on client accounts. Those are the types of things that policies and procedures should speak to in terms of the particular algorithm that the robo is using. Other things that the SEC thought were important with respect to policies and procedures: having policies and procedures that cover oversight of third parties who are outsourced certain responsibilities, such as the development or management of the algorithmic code or software modules that are used by the robo-advisor. And finally, just highlighting other points the SEC staff made in the guidance update, considering the internet delivery of robo-advice, there's obviously a heightened risk associated with cybersecurity and ensuring that client personally identifiable information is protected. So, one thing that policies and procedures of robo-advisors should be very keenly attuned to is the prevention and detection and response to cybersecurity threats. Obviously, all investment advisors are expected to address those issues, but the risks are enhanced in the robo-advisor context just because of the inherent nature of the business model. And I guess I would throw it to Michael to offer any final thoughts on this topic.
Thanks, Issa. Just one thing to mention on the robo-advisory guidance statement. Cliff mentioned at the top that there are kind of various principles and statements in this guidance update that go beyond robo-advisors, and I'm just going to offer one such example. Issa talked about the guidance statement's presentation of expectations regarding policies and procedures with respect to the use of the algorithm. There were also, on page 3 and 4 of the guidance statement, there's a slew of bullet points that talk about the staff's expectations regarding the disclosure obligations of an advisor that uses an algorithm. And these disclosures, as well as the policies and procedures point that Issa made, really apply equally to a bricks and mortar advisor that uses an algorithm as a central component of its advisory services. So I would really recommend that if you use an algorithm, even if you're not a robo-advisor, that you take account of the disclosures on pages 3 and 4 of the guidance statement, and included among those are disclose that you use an algorithm to manage client accounts, and what does the algorithm do? Does it really merely apportion allocation, or is it also rebalancing? Does it engage in other functions? What are the assumptions and limitations of the algorithm? What are the risks of the algorithm? When might the portfolio manager override the algorithm? And et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of them, but those are kind of fundamental disclosure expectations, I think, going forward for any advisor that uses an algorithm in managing client assets. And I think the staff, in the future, you will see enforcement cases where, even if it's a brick-and-mortar advisor, where an advisor manages assets using an algorithm, but either doesn't adopt the policies and procedures that Issa referenced or doesn't make the disclosures that I just referenced. So I would keep that in mind. I'm going to our next, turning to our next.
Michael, just one quick question before we get to the next. Would you agree that, like, for now, we're not expecting any new guidance or anything? I think where this plays out is the SEC exam review.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's right. There's no indication that the staff is now going to come out with a guidance statement just on algorithms, although one could query whether they should, given, for example, the tremendous guidance offered by the OCC with respect to the use of algorithms by bank trust departments that use algorithms to manage trust assets. But yeah, I think it's going to play out through the examination process. But they will reference, I think, going forward, the statements here in the guidance statement. So that's something to be aware of. Turning to the next subject on conflicted compensation, I think this is going to, it's been an issue obviously forever. It's going to continue to be an issue forever, but it's such a white-hot topic right now. We've seen a slew of cases that Issa is going to discuss in a few minutes recently that really go to the impact of revenue to an investment advisor from a party other than the client, whether it's 12D1 fees or a piece of the custodial fees, shareholder servicing fees, or some other economic benefit that they get from a clearing firm or a custodian, like reduced expenses, et cetera. That has an impact on the advice provided by the advisor, but is not fully disclosed. And I think that will be an increasing focus of the staff going forward, given recent events with the DOL rule and the interim chair of the SEC saying the SEC is now potentially going to step into the void and adopt a uniform standard of care or fiduciary duty. What has been the key focus of the Commission for Advisors with Conflicts? Well, it's disclosure. And so given where we are with the DOL rule and where we may be going with an SEC rule, this is only going to take on increasing importance. The other thing to keep in mind is, there's a lot of ammunition provided to the Commission and the staff by virtue of the instructions to Form ADV Part 2A, which is, of course, the brochure used by advisors. People should bear in mind that it's not enough to merely say you have a conflict. And the instructions to the form really drive that home. You have to disclose the nature of the conflict, the impact, the ramification of the conflict, and how the advisor is going to handle the conflict. And that's a lot of ammunition that the SEC can use, and you see that ammunition used in these enforcement cases that Issa is going to talk about in a second. I mean, the reality is when the SEC doesn't like something and doesn't think the advisor really managed the conflict well, they immediately turn to what is the disclosure that's provided, and if they really don't like something or they don't think it was handled well, they will say your disclosure just wasn't good enough. And again, the instructions in the Part 2A really provide ample ammunition for the staff and for the commission to really make that point. So I would really take to heart what Issa is about to talk about and bear it in mind, because I do think this is going to be an increasing focus of the commission in the future. Issa?
Great. Thanks, Michael. So moving on to these conflicted compensation arrangement cases, really we're going to divide them into two general buckets. The first discussion point is going to relate to no transaction fee or MTF Mutual Funds and the third-party payments that advisors might be receiving from the clearing firm sponsors of those programs. And then the second bucket was going to relate to mutual fund share class suitability. This is an issue that has been going white hot for the past 4 years or so, dating back originally to the Mannering case, but we're going to go over some cases and a recent risk alert that the SEC staff, or OC in particular, issued on the topic back in 2016. But moving into the MTF Mutual Funds discussion point, the most recent action on this was actually last month against Voya, and the basic fact pattern in the case was that Voya was receiving two different types of third-party payments from the clearing firm, both an administrative service fee and revenue sharing associated with the MTF program. And the conflict really arose out of the fact that the fees were only paid if client assets in the MTF program reached a specified threshold. And in addition to that, the fees increased with the amount of client assets that were placed in the MTF program. So Voya did offer some disclosure on the point. They did say that IARs would have an incentive to recommend mutual funds in the MTF program because of the MTF feature, but the SEC staff took issue with the disclosure, as Michael said. If the SEC doesn't like your practices, they'll find some issue with the disclosure, and they found an issue with this disclosure. And what the SEC said here was that the firm didn't disclose that it received the revenue sharing from the revenue sharing payments from the clearing firm based on the client assets invested in the program, rather than identifying the fact that the fees were tied to the amount that went into the no transaction fee mutual funds. The firm just said that it had a conflict. So clearly the SEC is saying here it's not enough to just say you have a conflict. You have to explain why you have a conflict and what you're doing about it. And on top of that, the SEC alleged that Voya didn't disclose the administrative services fee in its disclosures to clients either. So what are the takeaways from the Voya case? Well, clearly the SEC has an expectation now that that advisors should be reviewing all the revenue streams that are associated with the advice that you're providing to clients to ensure that all conflicted compensation arrangements are fully disclosed to clients. And one kind of overarching point here in this conflicted compensation arrangement area, which is kind of a point of, that hasn't really been, there hasn't really been much clarity on this particular point in a lot of these cases, and I'm going to get into that with respect to the mutual fund share class suitability issue. One issue that's arisen in connection with conflicted compensation is that it's really not been clear what the SEC expectations are around the idea of whether disclosure can be sufficient to properly mitigate the conflict. Clearly, in this Voya case, the SEC is saying that disclosure could have mitigated the conflict, but as we're going to see in the next set of cases, in some cases with respect to conflicted compensation, disclosure just can't can't relieve the firm of the conflict. So moving on to mutual fund share class suitability. As I mentioned, this issue is dated back to 2013. There was a case brought against Mandarin Investment Counsel in October 2013 that kind of kicked off the SEC's concern with this issue, and it's brought a number of cases since then. But the general issue that the SEC is focused on here is a situation where the investment advisor is placing clients in Class A shares of mutual funds that pay the advisor or its advisory personnel, its IARs, 12b1 fees, when cheaper institutional share classes of the same funds, which don't pay the 12b1 fees, might be available to clients. So in the cases that are listed here, the SEC uniformly found that investing the advisory clients in these higher fee mutual fund share classes instead of lower fee share classes of the same funds was a per se violation of the fiduciary duty owed to clients. And the basis for this violation was not disclosure. The basis for the violation was simply a failure to seek best execution and or act in the client's best interest. So what the SEC seems to be saying here in these three cases is that there was a seeming inability to cure the conflict through disclosure alone, that basically the advisor shouldn't have engaged in the practice in the first place, that the advisor shouldn't have been receiving this conflicted compensation in the first place. The SEC staff actually reinforced that approach in the 2016 Share Class Initiative Risk Alert. I actually quoted the particular language that the SEC staff had in that risk alert, kind of speaking to the notion that advisors are obligated, according to the SEC staff, to act in the client's best interest and to seek best execution for client transactions when they are selecting mutual fund share classes for clients. What's apparent about this quote is that the SEC staff is not saying anything about disclosure. It's a curious omission. What they're saying is that they're looking at the recommendation itself, not whether the advisor is providing fulsome disclosure to the issue. So some takeaways with respect to the risk alert: it suggests that the conflict of interest presented by mutual fund share classes may not be mitigated through disclosure alone, and that advisors have a fiduciary duty pursuant to their obligation to act in the client's best interest to recommend or select the cheapest available share class. And really, one other point here is that the SEC and its staff are really expanding the scope of the concept of best execution. Best execution, to this point, had been a concept really speaking to, the price that a particular client might have been getting on the transaction fees associated with a trade, or maybe the efficiency of a transaction. But really, the SEC and the SEC staff here are kind of expanding the scope of that, or expanding what best execution really means, or the context of it, to cover something that perhaps it might never have been intended to cover. So that's kind of an interesting development from that risk alert and those three cases that I mentioned before. Moving on to the most recent cases that the SEC's brought, these two cases that I'm about to discuss, they kind of beg the question as to whether they signal a shift in the SEC's position with respect to the efficacy of disclosure in mitigating conflicts associated with conflicted compensation. What's curious about these two cases is that the SEC seems to be indicating that disclosure could have saved the two firms from the conflicted compensation arrangements. And again, they relate to mutual fund share class suitability, just like the three cases that we mentioned earlier. But the interesting thing about the cases is that neither of the firms was sanctioned for failure to act in the client's best interest. In Credit Suisse, the firm was alleged to have violated its best execution obligation, but in explaining that alleged violation, the SEC actually implied that the best execution failure could have been disclosed away. And I quote the particular language here. you don't see that kind of language appearing in those first three cases. In the first three cases, they just say, there was a best execution violation and it couldn't have been disclosed away. Now the SEC seems to be indicating that it might have been disclosed away if the firm had mentioned it in its Form ADV brochure or its agreement with its clients. One side point about Credit Suisse that we thought was an interesting development in this area, and that should be a reminder to firms as they kind of evaluate their conflicted compensation arrangements. Credit Suisse was sanctioned in part for not disclosing its 12B1 compensation on its IAR's Form ADV Part 2B brochure supplement. In that case, the IARs of Credit Suisse were actually sharing in the 12B1 compensation, as they were in the advisor group case. In the advisor group case, the SEC didn't sanction the firm for any issues with its brochure supplements, but in the Credit Suisse case, the firm actually did. The SEC actually did take a look at the brochure supplements, notice that the compensation wasn't disclosed there, and sanction the firm for it. So one thing just to keep in mind and not to forget about when you're enhancing your disclosures on this point is to take a look at the 2B brochures in addition to any client agreements and Form ADV Part 2A brochure disclosures. So I thought I would pass it to Cliff for any additional takeaways.
Yeah, thanks, Issa. That was good information. Thank you. Before we sort of continue the discussion, just for those of you who are interested in CLE, the confirmation code is advisor. Okay, ADVISER. You got to sort of do the E versus the O. Advisor, ADVISER. So if you could please use this code for the sign-in sheet available for download from your viewing console. Thanks. Just picking up on Issa's remarks, I guess sort of the key thing, and Issa highlighted maybe some ambiguity from the staff as to whether disclosure cures a conflict. Is there a stepping away from that? And so it's always been, for those who've been practicing for a long time, there's always been an acceptance out there that disclosure cures conflicts. And in fact, that was reinforced by a speech by the SEC staff maybe 3 years ago now from Julie Rewe's speech.
2014, right?
Yeah, 20,000, yeah. Conflicts everywhere. The only thing I could add to the discussion is at recent conferences, senior staff from the asset management unit have said they have reinforced they're not looking to step back from Julie's speech, and they've reinforced that disclosure cures conflicts. And I think, this is my personal view, that there's an avenue for disclosure to cure the type of conflict that we're highlighting here, 12B1 fees. And again, I think we have to assume effective disclosure, the disclosure that you feel good about, where you're really making the point. But I really do think there is an avenue, and I think some of the ambiguity has been created. Maybe it's not intentional. Maybe it's just certain statements that are made, and there's not necessarily an overall coordination by the staff. But again, from at least the enforcement perspective, I don't think they're stepping away from disclosure. If it's effective, can cure conflicts. One question that came in, I think it sort of anticipates to what extent does an RIA have to offer additional share classes to satisfy its fiduciary duty. The cases we were talking about, there was an A share and an I share available.
Right.
So the question is, well, let's say we only offer an A share. Do we have to make I shares available? And I haven't read the cases to suggest that. I haven't read a fiduciary duty to sort of suggest that. Again, I think we get to disclosure. We offer A shares, and that I don't think that there's a push to sort of offer a broader universe of share classes.
Yeah, this is Michael. And I don't disagree. That being said, though, certainly in representing certain clients, if you're a dual registrant, and typically this is a bit of a generalization, but more often than not, this issue arises if you're a dual registrant. I have seen the staff be pretty aggressive, if you will, in the exam program, Because what they've done is they've asked firms to look at the selling agreements that the dual registrant has on the broker-dealer side, and those selling agreements may have language in them that indicate all the shares offered by the fund are available to be sold. And the other thing the staff has said is, look, in the past when you've sought out to get additional share classes added, have you been successful? And when the answer is yes, the follow-up question from the staff is, okay, well, why didn't you do that in this case or in that case in that case? So I agree with you. It's not. You won't find anything in writing that suggests that you have to. But at times the staff has been rather aggressive, in the examination process. I, for one, think the whole context of calling this or shaping this into a best execution issue is a bit silly and unfounded. From my perspective, this has absolutely nothing to do with execution at all. I mean, the execution was fine. There was no problem with the execution. The security that was placed in an order was what was obtained in a timely fashion. It's really what Issa said about the suitability and appropriateness of the recommendation. And if the staff has a problem with the advice provided, that's not a best execution issue.
I think that was an enforcement strategy. With those cases, I really think it was a deliberate enforcement strategy to try to make the case again about not the lowest share class available.
Agreed. I don't think it's proper though to label any of this as a best execution issue. Yeah. To me, it's not. It's a fundamental. It goes. If you want to say it's a 206 issue with respect to the advice provided, that's one thing, or the management of conflicts. Yes, I agree with that. But to label it an execution issue as opposed to a concern about the impact on the advice, I think they're different.
Yeah.
Anyway, why don't we?
Just one other point. Also, picking up on your point, Michael, about can an advisor offer just one share class. I just want to sort of pick up, and I think this was sort of what you're getting at. Sometimes an advisor says, we are going to restrict, but the clearing firm that they're using is not restricting. I mean, to restrict, it has to really be not available, which is, I think, the point you were making.
Yeah. Again, that's going to rise more often, I think, if you're a dual registrant.
Right. Thanks. I guess we should get to the next big topic. So we've handled digital advisors. We've handled conflicted comp and developments there. The other area that we wanted to touch upon where there's developments is the custody rule. And custody over the last few years has emerged either as one of or probably the most complicated of the Advisors Act rules. And the reason why, it grows out of the broad definition of what is custody. It's access, it's authorization. It's not just maintaining client securities and funds. There's a very broad definition of what is custody. And if you're dealing with custody, you have to be up on not only the rule, the regulatory release, but also FAQs that have come out, OC guidance, no action letters, enforcement actions. It really has become a complicated area. And there's 3 pieces of guidance that came out that we're going to cover. And the common theme with these pieces of guidance is that there's some grant of authority from the client giving the advisor the ability to disperse funds from the account. Okay? And what you'll hear reference to is third-party disbursements where the advisor has authority to disperse funds to a third party, or first party where it goes from the client to another account of the client. Okay, so keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, and we're going to sort of distinguish third party from first party. The other thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to turn it over to Issa to walk us through this, is we're not talking about a situation where the client authorizes the custodian directly to make a disbursement. If the client signs a letter to the custodian and says, move assets, that's leaving the advisor out of the picture. That's not custody. Sometimes people have sort of swept that into this discussion. Again, we're talking about where the advisor has authority to move client assets. So I'm going to turn it over to Issa to walk us through this material.
Thanks, Cliff. So the first of the 3 pieces of guidance that the SEC provided to firms back in February of this year had to do with standing letters of authorization, or SLOAs. And the guidance was provided through a no action letter that was issued to the Investment Advisor Association. And what the SEC staff kind of acknowledged from the get-go was that if an advisor is given a standing letter of authorization that permits the advisor or gives the advisor authority to disperse funds to one or more third parties pursuant to the standing letter of authorization, it does have custody. But what the letter really spoke to was the circumstances under which the advisor would be required to get a surprise exam with respect to the client account on which it has the standing letter of authorization. So what the letter did was set forth certain conditions relating to a standing letter of authorization that if those conditions were satisfied, the advisor would not have to include any affected accounts within any surprise exam that it would have to obtain under the custody rule. I don't want to necessarily get into the particular conditions in the interest of time. We are running a little bit low on time already, but this guidance and this no action letter is important for the purpose of establishing that a particular account over which you have a standing letter of authorization can be excluded from any surprise exam that you're required to obtain otherwise under the custody rule. The second piece of guidance that the SEC came out with at the same time as the IAA letter was an update to an existing FAQ that the SEC staff had previously issued, and it was in particular FAQ number 2.4, which had described the circumstances under which an advisor would not be deemed to have custody where the advisor is given authority to transfer client assets between like-titled accounts of the client. Maybe client has an account with your custodian and also has a bank account a personal checking account at a separate bank. Client wants to transfer money from their custodial account to their bank account. That FAQ kind of spoke to that situation and whether an advisor would be deemed to have custody if it was granted the authority to effect that movement of money on behalf of the client. And the SEC staff had taken originally, in the original formulation of FAQ 2.4, a pretty stringent view that a lot of firms thought was impractical. And a number of clearing firms and industry groups had lobbied the SEC to get a loosening or a relaxation of the FAQ guidance. And what happened here is that they essentially succeeded on that in that regard. What was a key touch point here was getting the client authorization to both the sending and the receiving banks or custodians. What the SEC staff did in its revision to 2.4 is actually only require the delivery of the authorization to the sending firm, the sending custodian. So that's an improvement. But give with one hand, take with another. The SEC also clarified that the authorization has to include more information than was originally understood by the industry. Now firms are actually required, or it's more. They were always been required to do this, but it's more clear now that they actually have to ensure that the authorization from the client includes the specific account numbers that are involved. So that's the guidance in 2.4. The last piece of guidance that the SEC staff issued had to do with inadvertent custody, and this was covered in a guidance update that the Division of Investment Management issued at around also the same time that the two other pieces of guidance came out. And the scenario covered here is the situation where the agreement between the client and the custodian or clearing firm contains language permitting the advisor to withdraw or transfer client funds or securities upon instruction to the custodian. This is language that the custodians might have developed on their own, unbeknownst to the advisor. And the client executes the agreement, and perhaps the custodian's not willing to revise the language and go back and update every single client agreement to to solve for this inadvertent custody that has resulted. And what this guidance update does is provide advisors with some guidance with respect to solving for this inadvertent custody. So the fix that the SEC staff suggested is the advisor drafting a letter addressed to both addressed to the custodian that limits the advisor's authority to delivery versus payment, notwithstanding the wording of the custodial agreement, and having the client and the custodian providing written consent to the acknowledgement. So that's the fix that the SEC staff has suggested that advisors can take to solve for that inadvertent custody. And I thought I'd throw it to Michael to offer any final thoughts.
Yeah, it's not much of a fix because in the real world, this is going to potentially be problematic to implement. I mean, I've had clients tell me that for a variety of reasons, they have clients that won't even show the terms of the custody agreement that the client has with the custodian. So I've had advisors say, look, we don't see the custody agreement all the time. So I'm not sure in that situation how something like this is going to be implemented. And it's a pretty harsh result, really, for an advisor to be held to legal standards and potentially legal liability for an agreement between two third parties that the advisor has nothing to do with. May not even, I mean, they're going to know it exists, but they may not be aware of the terms, and it's not their agreement. They're not a party. Why should they be held to be subject to all these responsibilities and liability? Because don't forget, the custody rule is an anti-fraud rule. It's a 206 rule. So potentially it's a pretty big repercussion for something that the advisor has absolutely nothing to do with. So I think it's a harsh result. I understand the logic behind it, but I think it's a harsh and potentially unfair result for advisors. On the standing letter of authorization, I'll just make one point, and then we should move on in the interest of time. I think the staff here did something very rational. I think their approach to standing letters of authorization makes a lot of sense. Essentially, they took the same approach to standing letters of authorization that they took with advisors that have custody solely because they have the ability to deduct fees. So if you're an advisor that has authority to get your fees out of the custodian's account by giving an instruction to the custodian, you have custody, but you don't have to get a surprise examination. There's an explicit provision in the rule that provides for that. And they basically said, let's do the same thing here. Because here, you're not sending advisory fees to yourself, you're sending funds to pursuant to a standing letter of authorization, but we have all these controls around it which limit the concerns that we have, so therefore we're not going to require a surprise examination. I think that's a very logical approach and an approach that the industry is very familiar with, given the existing exception for advisors that have custody because they have the ability to get their fees out. So why don't we turn to the next topic of trading away?
Yeah. And just before we get there, one quick point on the custody. I think we'll see additional guidance, or at least a movement to get additional guidance on the inadvertent custody piece, because there's just so many unanswered questions. With respect to standing letters, the staff has suggested that firms have 6 months. They've thrown that out to get into compliance. So there's a little bit of a time period where the staff expects advisors to be working with the custodians to ensure compliance with that no action letters. Turning to sort of our next topic, trading away in wrap accounts. Obviously, like the starting point when we deal with a topic like this is a wrap account. The fact that there's a single fee for advisory and trade execution, and here we're talking about where the portfolio manager trades not through the sponsor but through another broker-dealer that entails an extra fee to the client. Okay, that's the starting point. And what you're going to hear is heightened expectations from the SEC through enforcement actions, calling for heightened controls, heightened disclosures, and not just from the portfolio manager perspective, but also from the sponsor perspective. So again, for all the participants, this development of these enforcement actions are important. So I'm going to just throw it to Issa to walk us through the cases.
Sure. So before I get into the cases, I thought I would just quickly lay out the typical scenario that's covered in these cases. Typically, you have a client enrolling in a wrap fee program that's sponsored by a dual registrant who pays an AUM fee that includes advisory services and trade execution. And typically, the sub-advisors are supposed to be trading through the sponsor, but the sub-advisor might trade away through another broker-dealer, and then in that case, you have a client paying a trade execution fee that's in addition to the wrap fee. So the SEC's main concerns on this topic: whether the client's being overcharged for the trades that are traded away. Is the client getting best execution when the sub-advisor trades away? What is being disclosed to the client about the frequency about the tradeaways or the amounts that are being charged to them? And then finally, is the program sponsor monitoring sub-advisor trading away activity to ensure the continued suitability of the sub-advisory arrangement? So moving on to the first case, I'll just quickly run through these. In the Riverfront case, really this is a case in which the advisor's trade away practices changed and the disclosures just didn't keep up with it. The fees associated with tradeaways had increased, and then the disclosures just didn't match. They became outdated. So what's the takeaway from this case? As your tradeaway practices change, you have an obligation, obviously, to update your disclosures. The disclosure is worth a prompt update to your Form ADV brochure, and then also don't forget to include the changes in your material changes section of your brochure. Moving on to the next case, the Raymond James case. This case and the next two cases were really policies and procedures cases having to do with oversight of tradeaway practices. And in the Raymond James case, you had a situation where the SEC alleged that the advisor failed to have compliance policies and procedures that recorded information from sub-advisors regarding the amounts they were charging for trading away, and that required a determination as to the materiality of the trading away costs. So you also had client account statements that didn't fully disclose the amount of trade away costs that the clients were paying. So what are the takeaways from this case? You should have policies and procedures to track your sub-advisors' trading away practices and how much they're costing clients. And then you should also be as clear as possible with clients about how much they're paying. Next case, the Baird case, again, a policies and procedures case. And both the Baird case and the next case, the steeple case, in both of those cases, the SEC claimed that the advisor didn't have compliance policies and procedures to track which sub-advisors were trading away, how often they were doing it, and the specific costs associated with it. So these are 3 points that it seems that the SEC thinks should be the fundamental issues covered in any policies and procedures that you implement to handle trading away in wrap fee programs. One thing that this advisor did that earned it some credit as part of its settlement with the SEC, it had actually set up a website listing the percentage of time that each sub-advisor traded away and the average cost associated with the trades for the prior calendar year. So as a prophylactic measure, you could consider that approach. Again, the steeple case, as I mentioned, had to do with the same policies and procedures issues. They didn't have policies and procedures to track which sub-advisors were trading away, how often they were doing it, and the costs associated. steeple had provided some disclosures that trading away may happen, but what the SEC determined was that the disclosures just weren't sufficient. And then on top of that, there wasn't a process to track how much sub-advisor tradeaways were costing clients, and and to track on an ongoing basis whether the sub-advisor trading away practices was giving rise to the sub-advisor no longer being suitable for the client. So takeaways from that case is just it's insufficient to merely disclose that sub-advisors might be trading away or may be trading away. You have to take the extra step of determining which advisors are doing it, how often they're doing it, and the costs associated, and then inform IARs and clients so that they have the information they need to make a decision as to the suitability of the sub-advisor. Final thoughts on this. I think it's clear that the SEC now has taken the position that you should have policies and procedures covering these three critical areas. Monitoring to see whether your sub-advisors are engaging in tradeaways. If they are, conducting diligence to see if they're meeting their best execution obligations, and then also taking a look at your disclosures to make sure they're being the practices are being disclosed to clients. Some suggestions. It would be probably a good idea to take a look at your agreements with your sub-advisors to see if they include a rep that the sub-advisor will meet their best execution obligations. And then you could also consider in those agreements requiring sub-advisors to periodically report their trade-away information. And just a final reminder, trading away in this context can be permissible, but the keys are ensuring best execution, documenting the frequency and the cost of it, and then disclosing the practices to clients. And I thought I would turn it over to Michael again for any final thoughts.
Yeah, very quickly, given where we are with time. It's a little ironic. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, having to deal with SEC examiners who were asking, why aren't you trading away in the context of a wrap program, because the execution quality by the sponsor was not nearly as good as what you could get from a boutique broker-dealer, and even after taking into consideration the additional costs, the execution costs, you'd still come out better by trading away. So here we've come full circle, or not full circle, we've gone the other side. These are big because the cases really, it could potentially change the economics of wrap programs. I mean, the message of these cases is if you're sponsoring a wrap program, you need to understand what the sub-advisors are doing with respect to trading away. So you need to get periodic reporting from the sub-advisors on their trading away practices, and then amend your disclosure to clients if appropriate, if required, if the frequency of trading away is going up, if you see it's really increasing the cost to clients. So it's just another cost and tracking function and reporting function that sponsors of wrap programs are now going to have to build into their economics to make sure that they work. Cliff, why don't we finish with the exam priorities?
Yeah, so just 30 seconds on this and then we'll wrap up. We did get some additional questions. We try to incorporate as best we can, and sorry if we haven't, but we'll figure out a way to somehow incorporate or get back to you. But thanks for the questions. All we wanted to do in this is just remind folks that the SEC did release in February their exam, their 5 most frequent deficiencies, and we just wanted you to have it as reference. No real surprises. Compliance policies and procedures 20647, ADVs that were not timely updated, the custody rule, that's just a perennial issue at this point, code of ethics rule, and the SEC cited not having a complete list of access persons. One of the first things that SEC examiners do is ask for access persons and books and records, which will always be on sort of the top 5. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. And Michael, Issa, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And please plan on joining us for the next program in this series, so our third quarterly update, which is going to be held Thursday, September 14th, beginning at noon Eastern. So 2 reminders. If you want to receive CLE credit for this webcast, please download the CLE sign-in sheet and evaluation form from your viewing console and follow the instructions for submission. And finally, if you have any questions or if you would like to request a copy of the slide deck, please contact any one of us, Michael, Issa, or me, and we'd be happy to get you the deck. Thanks very, very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.